Hello, learners, and welcome to the seventh lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century women's novels. We have been discussing the work of Nella Larsen, and in particular, I have been building towards a discussion of the novel Passing. I have introduced several key ideas so far, and in particular, I have been developing the importance of choice as it applies to our understanding of several key themes in this novel. And to summarize very briefly a key idea, it was easy for readers to accept that an individual could choose to allow themselves to be perceived as white, even though they were born as black. This was an easy choice, but it was less easy for readers to accept that the same individual might choose a romantic partner or a friend or a companion or an intimate partner simply based on their preference. Therefore, the relationship between Claire Kendry and Irene Redfield is presented as one that might be dangerous, not only because it violates one of the most obvious rules, that of race, but also that of same-sex relationships. And I've also mentioned briefly that Deborah McDowell was among the earliest scholars to provide a detailed commentary and analysis of this theme. We will be complicating this idea a little bit in our reading and try to understand exactly how these two forms of choice interact very powerfully. In fact, they are actually one choice, and in fact, they deepen our understanding of what passing really means in this world and in this novel. Before I begin a textual analysis of the novel, I want to make few comments about the context and a few summary comments about the way these two characters are delineated. So, on the surface, it appears that there is a very clear and obvious difference between Claire Kendry and Irene Redfield. And if one takes the title of the novel literally, one can arrive at a somewhat simplistic understanding of the difference between these two characters. And one can also see how a tension between these two characters shapes the novel. Irene Redfield is a character who passes sometimes, and Claire Kendry is a character who has passed permanently. Beyond this obvious difference, however, there are a lot of much deeper similarities and some slight differences which also complicate many conventional and dominant early 20th century American understandings of choice. One of these very common understandings of choice and the motivations for passing was the relationship between economic standing or social power and how one approached one's race. So it was commonly understood that ever since the legal abolition of chattel slavery and the beginning of the economic ascendancy of the black middle class, the choice of passing was deeply related to one's economic circumstances. In other words, if a black person was born into abject poverty or very solidly working class and socially disabled backgrounds, then it was understood that they had a more obvious reason to pass. On the other hand, if a person was born into the black middle class, they had relatively open opportunities for education and a comfortable material life, then they would have less obvious motivations to pass. This is also complicated somewhat in the fate of these two characters. Claire Kendry is a character whose motivations for passing, as the novel presents it to us, and I will read from the first chapter of this novel, are not, strictly speaking, those of economic upliftment or material well-being. Rather, they are questions of choice. Claire Kendry passes, we are told, because she has a certain type of personality. It's a personality which is referred to in the Black vernacular of the novel as a having personality. She's the kind of person who is referred to among her friends and associates as someone who likes to have things. And because of this desire of hers to want things and to possess the things that she wants, she decides to make certain choices. And it just so happens that the most momentous choice, the choice that determines the rest of her life and defines her identity for the purposes of this novel is her choice to allow herself to be taken for white. On the other hand, Irene has very different motivations for passing. Irene actually has those very motivations. That is to say, Irene has the opportunity to want these finer things. She is not facing material collapse. Survival is not a struggle. And if Irene wanted, Irene might have chosen to pursue the so called finer things. However, Irene decides to not chase those things. Irene makes a different choice. And so both these individuals, they make very different choices with regards to the kind of lives they want. For neither of these two characters is the motivation to pass directly connected to their material conditions. This is a very important point to note because for a lot of fictional representations of racial passing in the early 20th century, economic survival was often seen as the most obvious motivation for taking such a drastic step. For making a decision like this, which would ultimately result in the end of certain kinds of relationships and would exert a great deal of undue pressure on the individuals to continuously keep remaking their identities. So, this is the first thing to note. The second thing to note is that at the time that this novel, Passing, began to enjoy a great deal of critical attention and began to be interpreted in ways that could illuminate not just race relations and could shed light on the meaning of human identity itself and not just racial identity. It was a time when it was beginning to be discovered that many well known, influential figures, Black scholars, writers, and cultural luminaries of the late 20th century, actually had lived double lives for many decades, that there were many individuals who had passed and who, at some point in the late 20th century, began to come out with this revelation that they had been living a double life. But what exactly was the motivation for revealing their true or so called true identity to the public is not clear. Some of these individuals revealed to the public that while they were seen as white, they were actually black. And for some, the reverse was true. And I'll just take the names of some of these individuals and quote briefly from their memoirs and their life writing to give a sense of the intellectual and philosophical stakes that are at play in representing this kind of a shift in one's racial identity, and what exactly is the emotional labor being done by revealing or setting the record straight in these narratives. So the first such individual is Anatole Broyard, who was book reviewer for the New York Times, among the most well-read and influential book reviewers for the newspaper. In the year 1990, just before he passed away, he revealed to his children and eventually to the rest of the world that although he was always seen as a white writer, he was actually born black in 1920 in New Orleans, Louisiana. And the most interesting sentence from his memoir, Kafka Was the Rage, goes thus. And my source for these quotes is Thaddeus Davis's introduction to the Penguin Classics edition of Passing, which I think was published in the year 2003. The details will be provided in this course. In his memoir, Kafka Was the Rage, Anatole Broyard wrote, I had a literature rather than a personality, a set of fictions about myself. And there was something about being secretive, being closeted, to use another very loaded word, and another word which actually helps illuminate a great deal of passing as well. Not revealing one's true identity or maintaining as true something which one treats as a fiction. It exerts a great deal of intellectual pressure on these individuals, and the pressure of maintaining this truth and falsity at the same time is such that it creates narratives, and it is a source of writing culture and a source of intellectual production for many such individuals. Now, while Broyard was a very successful writer, journalist, and maintained a very successful life of the mind, there were others in the 20th century who did not have as comfortable lives, and I'll name briefly two such individuals. So, one is Gregory Williams, who wrote a book titled Life on the Color Line: The True Story of a White Boy Who Discovered He Was Black. So the story goes that his father, that is Tony Williams, was born in Washington, D.C., and eventually decided to pass for white, despite advice from Alan Locke, the well known Harlem Renaissance intellectual, that he could be successful as a black intellectual. But despite maintaining a successful life as a white man and starting a family with a white American woman, for many years the marriage broke down and he decided to move back to Indiana. And so it was during this one bus journey, a Greyhound bus journey from Washington, D.C. to Indiana, that Gregory Williams found out that he was white when the bus journey began, but he ended up being black when the bus journey ended. And the third individual who I will name and whose memoir I will quote from is the writer Shirley Taylor Haslip, who wrote a book, The Sweeter the Juice, a family memoir in black and white. She writes the story of helping her mother reunite with her own siblings who were separated because these siblings decided to pass for white, and her mother, having somewhat darker skin, could not make the jump across the color line. And the very powerful and telling quote comes near the end of the book, where Haslip writes, I began the search for my mother's family, believing that I was looking for black people passing for white, and they did indeed pass. But what I ultimately found, I realized, were black people who had become white. And so this is a very important idea, and this is, in a nutshell, the key perception-based problem that passing is always trying to dramatize. In fact, this is the problem that lies at the heart of Passing. Passing, the novel, is a dramatization of the tensions, the anxieties, the contradictions that emerge when individuals struggle with their own perceptions of themselves. So both Claire Kendry and Irene Redfield, light-skinned black women, whatever black woman means in the context of early 20th century America. And because of certain physical features, they are able to allow themselves to be recognized as white. But they are still not able to escape the dominant modes of perception of the society in which they live. More specifically, they're not able to escape the dominant definitions of beauty, what is considered to be an attractive or an aesthetically pleasing kind of appearance. Not only are they not able to escape these notions, but they themselves operate within these notions. So they often struggle with the idea that what they define as attractive in feminine figures, faces or the shapes of faces or bodies, are often those of white American femininity. And they recognize that they are attracted to these features themselves, but they also realize that they have very different views. They are ideologically and psychologically very, very opposed to the ideologies of race and white supremacy that these identities and these communities hold. So Passing, the novel, is really a reconstruction of the very, very delicate emotional brokering that one always has to undertake with oneself in order to maintain this kind of a life. It's a double life, but only these two individuals who are themselves passing, sometimes or always, recognize the toll that it takes on the individual who decides to pass. I will now go to the opening of the novel, which is a very, very powerful textual moment. And before I talk about the opening of the novel, I want to briefly mention something about the trope of the romance novel. Now, this is not a romance novel. This is not about romantic love in the way that many romance novels are. And yet, the way the novel begins and the way the novel sets up its descriptions of events, the framing devices, the way the novel describes a character's memories, the way the novel describes the friendship that emerges between these two individuals, and the way the novel describes the memories of an individual. All of these things remind one very powerfully of some very typical tropes that one finds in romance novels, which also reminds me of very important ideological alignment between the romance novel. This novel can be best characterized as literary fiction because it explores in a very realistic way the philosophical, psychological, and other intellectual problems associated with a very common social phenomena. So, what is this intellectual alignment or ideological alignment? And we come down again to this idea of choice. A lot of popular romance turns on the idea of choice. The ideology of a romance novel, if there can be such a thing, is that human choice matters, that class positions, political positions, the relationships or the oppositions between individuals that are decided by society, such as how rich one is, what kind of a political party one belongs to, what one's social background is, what one's racial background is, what one's religious background is, etc., etc. The ideology of the romance novel is that these ways of defining human choice ultimately matter less than the ability of two individuals to make a choice for themselves. Now, whether or not this belief is based on reality or whether it is a kind of fantasy, that's a different question. But in the way that romance novels and most romance narratives are set, they reinforce this belief that two individuals can choose. Now, in that sense, if we take only that idea and we trace the way this novel describes the relationship between Claire Kendry and Irene Redfield, we'll find that it is, in fact, pushing the boundaries of realistic representation of race relations. If there is a tension in this novel, the tension is between being respectful towards the reality of race relations, and on the other hand, also being sensitive to the power of dreaming, to the power of hoping that individuals can choose the way they relate to each other. And I won't summarize anymore, but I'll try to describe the way the novel begins. It begins with a very short first chapter, and the task of this first chapter is to set up the events that follow in the second one. And we see Irene Redfield, who's living a perfectly bourgeois existence, very comfortable, very well off, not rich, but very comfortable. She gets up one morning and she looks at a pile of letters, and there's one letter that stands out from the rest in the pile. And this letter has certain characteristics. It has an envelope of thin Italian paper, and the writing is in purple ink, and it doesn't have a return address. Also, it has foreign paper of extraordinary size. These are enough to signal to Irene that there is something unusual, that there's something amiss, and it makes Irene a bit sensitive and suspicious. She notices then that it was postmarked in New York. And then she realizes, and the narrator speaks in free indirect discourse, describing what Irene feels. Her brows came together in a tiny frown. The frown, however, was more from perplexity than from annoyance, though there was in her thoughts an element of both. She was wholly unable to comprehend such an attitude towards danger, as she was sure the letter's contents would reveal, and she disliked the idea of opening and reading it. Further, we learn This, she reflected, was of a piece with all she knew of Claire Kendry, stepping always on the edge of danger, always aware but not drawing back or turning aside. Certainly not because of any alarms or feeling of outrage on the part of others. And she begins to figure out, as Irene begins to figure out, what is the connection between these feelings of trepidation and what she knew of Claire Kendry. She begins to create a visual image for the reader of what she remembered of Claire. And then we are given an image of Claire as a girl who was working as a seamstress, who was stitching clothes, making some money, and not giving the full amount of money that she was earning to her father because she had decided something. And this is a very important clue to the kind of person the narrator is creating for us, the kind of impression the narrator is creating for the readers of Claire Kendry. And I'm going to read this paragraph at length. Claire had known well enough that it was unsafe to take a portion of the dollar that was her weekly wage for doing the many errands for the dressmaker who lived on the top floor of the building in which Bob Kendry was janitor. But that knowledge had not deterred her. She wanted to go to her Sunday school's picnic, and she had made up her mind to wear a new dress. So, in spite of certain unpleasantness and possible danger, she had taken the money to buy the material for that pathetic little red frock. There had been, even in those days, nothing sacrificial in Claire Kendry's idea of life, no allegiance beyond her own immediate desire. She was selfish and cold and hard, and yet she had, too, a strange capacity of transforming warmth and passion, verging sometimes almost on theatrical heroics. So, this is a very important paragraph, and I just want to reflect on it for a moment before moving on. It says something very important about choice. Claire Kendry does some work. She's not born into a very comfortable family. Her father is a janitor. They are living in a house that's owned by someone else, and she does errands, domestic labor, for the dressmaker and earns a little money. And she is expected to hand over the money she earns to her father. One day, however, she decides that she would like to not do exactly that. She would depart from conventional or expected behavior. She would keep a portion of the dollar which she had earned and not hand over the whole amount because she had decided that she wanted a new dress. And this decision, which might seem to be a harmless little girl's indulgence for herself, is presented by the narrator in somewhat harsh and very, very judgmental terms. The narrator tells us that there was nothing sacrificial in Claire Kendry's idea of life, and the adjectives used are hard, selfish, and cold. Now, it's important to note that the narrator is describing to us not just who Claire Kendry was or is, but also the way that Irene Redfield remembers Claire Kendry. And in this dynamic, the narrator gives us a portrait of the newly emergent but rapidly ascending Black middle class. There were individuals like Irene Redfield who held on to these hierarchies of class very, very tightly because it was key to their own well being. So, from the kind of upbringing that Irene has, a little girl choosing not to hand over the full amount to her father, choosing instead to keep some money aside so she can buy a new dress for herself, so she can attend the Sunday school picnic, can only appear selfish. This is a very important dynamic that these two characters will share. Eventually, however, this dynamic will change. Another thing to note that this moment is happening chronologically after the events that the novel will describe. In fact, the rest of the novel will be a series of events which will be a recollection. So this is a time when Irene is looking back with hindsight, with a very particular hindsight. So Irene is disposed to judge Claire negatively in light of certain events that have taken place between this memory and this time that she is indulging this memory. What are those events? Those events turn on the way race and sexuality are deployed in different ways by these two different women. In this first chapter, the trepidation gradually increases, and Irene goes through a whole gamut of anxieties, nervousness, and a whole range of feelings of unease as she builds up to and decides to finally read the letter. And I'm just going to very briefly read from this letter and then stop this lecture. I will discuss it in the next one. We are told that Irene is filled with a sort of anger. It's not exactly anger, but there is something vindictive in Irene's response to knowing that she has received this communication from Claire. Irene, we are told, she saw at once what she had expected since learning from the postmark that Claire was in the city. An extravagantly phrased wish to see her again. Well, she needn't and she wouldn't, Irene told herself, accede to that. Nor would she assist Claire to realize her foolish desire to return for a moment to that life which long ago and of her own choice she had left behind her. So we are beginning to see the emotional dynamic between these two individuals. We are not told exactly why or what is the source of this unease, but we are told that there is a very clear, a very powerful sense of unease between these two individuals. Irene, who receives a letter, anticipates that Claire wants to see her again, and Irene decides very firmly and with almost a kind of contempt that she will not do so because she has no intention of allowing Claire to return to a life that she herself had relinquished. Now, this is a very complex and complicated idea for which at this point we have received no explanation or no indication. And then Irene reads some words from the letter, which produces a very clear reaction. The words that Irene reads from Claire are, "For I am lonely, so lonely, cannot help longing to be with you again, as I have never longed for anything before, and I have wanted many things in my life. You can't know how in this pale life of mine, I am all the time seeing the bright pictures of that other that I once thought I was glad to be free of. It's like an ache, a pain that never ceases, sheets upon thin sheets of it, and ending finally with, and it's your fault, Reen dear, at least partly, for I wouldn't know now, perhaps, have this terrible, this wild desire if I hadn't seen you that time in Chicago." And then we read about Irene's reaction to these words. Brilliant red patches flamed in Irene Redfield's warm olive cheeks. So I'll stop here, but just to flag for the next lecture some key ideas for discussion. The key message that comes through in Claire's letter is that she's undergoing a great deal of personal anguish. She regrets certain things. She regrets making a certain decision. She's filled with longing for a life that she has given up. She thought that she would be better off if she had given up that life, but now she regrets. She realizes that she might have been wrong, and she wants the life that she had given up. But this is not all. She is writing to Irene because she actually blames Irene for some of this complication. In fact, at the end, she accuses Irene that if she hadn't met Irene in Chicago at one point, then maybe she would have gone on with the rest of her life without these feelings of regret. So she wants a version of herself, but she also wants something with Irene, and it's not clear exactly what she wants. But what is clear is that Irene, upon reading these words, has a very strong physiological reaction, which is brilliant red patches flamed in her warm olive cheeks. This is how the first chapter ends, and this is the hook or the anchor from which the events of the rest of the novel are described. I'll stop here and continue in the next lecture. Thank you.